We have a lot to talk about this evening, so let's move directly to our guest, Greg Bluestein. Greg, you truly need no introduction to this crowd. We are so grateful to you for the vital role you play in keeping us informed and educated on the local political issues that mean so much to all of us. But now you're also about to be a published author. We are so excited to read your new book, Flipped: How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. I know I can speak for all of us when I say that we feel like we lived this book and we haven't even read it yet. We are eager to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Our title for tonight's discussion is Georgia's Elections, Past, Present, and Future. But let's shake up the order and start with the present. Talk to us, Greg, about what just happened in Virginia, and specifically about the urban-rural divide. What's the takeaway for Georgia?
Great question. And first, thank you so much for having me here. And you're right, you guys did live this. It was really fun for me watching as your group became a real power player in local and really state politics too. And not just in the last few election cycles, but also on issues combating anti-Semitism and other major issues that were confronting Georgians over in the recent months, unfortunately. So it's really an honor to come speak to you. As to your question about what we can take away from Virginia, look, there's a lot we could take away. There's a lot we could try to read into. It's really hard to read into this stuff though, because as you all know, off-year elections are not necessarily great indicators of what happens in a midterm election. The party in power does always, generally tend to struggle in midterm elections, but Georgia's electorate is so much different from Virginia's. For one, it's a lot more diverse. Virginia relies on a lot more white liberal Democrats voting, especially around the Washington area, whereas the backbone of the Georgia Democratic Party is really Black women, African-American voters in general, but really Black women. You had a imperfect candidate running for governor in Virginia with Terry McAuliffe, an older white man who struggled with his message near the end with a muddled message and focused a lot on Donald Trump, where it needs no reminding that Stacey Abrams, should she run, which we all expect she will, and we can get into that later. Stacey Abrams is not a white man. She's an African-American woman who would be the first Black woman elected governor in the nation. And her message in 2018, if that is any indication, was not about Trump, and it could have been, right? Trump was very unpopular with Democrats in 2018, but she chose not to make Trump an issue. She actually referred to him as the man in the White House and would only talk about Trump when nudged by reporters like me or voters on the campaign trail. Really, she focused her message on mostly broader-based themes like education, expanding Medicaid, tax credits for struggling Georgians, issues that she felt would appeal to a broad-based range of voters. Rather than, she did talk about some more liberal issues, but she tended to focus, especially her TV ads, on broader issues in the campaign. So those are just a few of the differences. Certainly, Democrats continue to struggle in rural areas in Virginia and in New Jersey to a lesser degree, which is off-putting. I mean, for Democrats going to the future, Republicans in 2018 and in 2020 tried to wring out every single vote they could in deep red counties. I mean, we're talking about counties that had went 80% for John McCain or Mitt Romney in previous presidential election cycles, that went 90% for Donald Trump and Brian Kemp. So these are sparsely populated counties, but they add up. There's 159 counties in Georgia, and you start winning these counties by those types of margins, you can put together a pretty strong coalition. But the real concern for Democrats going into the next cycle is whether or not they can keep their suburban coalition together. That's where the votes are. We've seen Gwinnett County go from Republican stronghold, and Cobb County go from these Republican bastions to not just Democratic, but the cornerstone of the Democratic strategy. Democrats were winning these counties by 50, deep into the 50% percentile of the votes, while also maximizing their turnout and their version of rural Georgia, which is DeKalb and Clayton. They were getting, well into the 80% in those blue bastions. So Republicans will try to, of course, counter Democratic strength in the suburbs with strength in not just rural areas, but the exurbs. And that's becoming the real test as well, is how Democrats do in Forsyth County, Cherokee County, Bartow County, some of those sort of outer ring counties surrounding Metro Atlanta, where Democrats did Joe Biden did fairly well. I mean, surprisingly well in Cherokee County and Forsyth County, held his own, didn't come close to winning, but got, about a fifth of the vote in those counties, which is a dramatic improvement from Democrats in past election cycles. So that's where we'll see some of the challenges ahead. But I'll put it this way, no Republicans, they might be publicly saying that Virginia is a great, indicator of what can happen in 2022. But they face their own major challenges that Youngkin didn't face in Virginia. For one, his hands-off approach to Donald Trump seemed to work. He was able to win without attending a rally with Donald Trump and really staying on Donald Trump's good side. Republicans here don't have that luxury. Brian Kemp is facing a very real threat of a primary challenge from David Perdue. You've all heard Donald Trump's vendetta against Brian Kemp, where he's pledged repeatedly to campaign against the sitting governor who he endorsed just a few years ago. And going even beyond that, saying multiple times, it wasn't just some joke, that he would rather have seen Stacey Abrams win the gubernatorial election in 2018. So we're in this unprecedented times here. And it's not just the governor's race. There's divisions within the Secretary of State race, in the lieutenant governor's race, and to a degree in the Senate contest with Herschel Walker, all where Trump has directly weighed into 4 statewide races and disavowed 3 or 4 statewide Republican candidates. So Republicans won't have a luxury of a united front going into 2022 in a way that Democrats frankly will. I mean, Senator Warnock, who I was with earlier today, has no credible primary threat on his side of the aisle. And Stacey Abrams is pretty much a clear field. I know we wrote earlier this week that Michael Thurmond has raised his hand just in case. He's saying he's willing to think about a run, but to be clear, Michael Thurmond is not in the Stacey Abrams orbit. They don't have the same political ideologies. They're not necessarily that close. And every Democrat close to Stacey Abrams who I've talked to, and this could change, but up until this morning, continues to think firmly that she will run in 2022. And if she doesn't, Democrats at a real disadvantage because you're wasting months. Stacey Abrams doesn't have to worry about that. She can raise, who knows, $10 million in her first day. I mean, that's the sort of financial fundraising power she has. So if you're in her camp, you feel like you can wait until early next year, or maybe later this year, but probably early next year, to jump in the race and not really give up too much of a fundraising advantage to Brian Kemp. Oh, and I think you are on mute, Valerie.
There we are. Sorry about that. But, phones ringing, dogs barking.
I'm in that boat, trust me.
So, Greg, there's a lot of good news in that, and I feel a little bit reassured. I have already lost a lot of sleep, but I'll try to catch up on it now that I've had that little bit of reassurance. But talk to me a little bit about this whole anti-woke movement and what the implications of that, because a lot of people are saying that that's part of the takeaway from Virginia. So what are your thoughts on that? Yeah,
I mean, we saw that firsthand in Georgia, helping to energize Republican voters. I know a lot of people were shocked, for instance, when Senator Kelly Loeffler wrote that famous open letter about the WNBA, basically disavowing her own team, saying that the WNBA should not embrace the Black Lives Matter movement and that sports should stay, politics should stay out of the sports. That was basically an anti-woke attempt, right? And it was met with all sorts of outrage. It was met with backlash from the sports world. Her entire team wore T-shirts that wrote "Vote Warnock," right? Major news that was all over the headlines. But meanwhile, at the same time, it was energizing Republicans. It was mobilizing conservatives. I was with her in Woodstock, of course, the excerpt, the really all-important excerpt we were just talking about. I think it was the day after she wrote that letter. And it was a packed campaign rally at a restaurant in Woodstock where voter after voter was like, hey, I wasn't really tuned into this race, but now I am. So it really resonated with conservatives. And I expect more of those sort of wedge issues. I think that in 2022, I think that both parties to a degree, but it's certainly, I think more so the Republicans have realized that trying to play to the middle isn't isn't effective anymore. That there, in a sense, Governor Kemp made the bet in 2018 that there was no middle anymore. You know, he did his very best to play to his party's base with the shotgun ad, with the pickup truck, with the the chainsaw against restrictions, through the very last, very final stretch of the race. I mean, if you recall, he barely campaigned in Metro Atlanta in the final 2 weeks of the 2018 race, putting all his marbles on TV ads here and in-person campaigning down in rural parts of the state that don't really get that much attention. So I think we're going to see more of that. There'll be wedge issues that play in media that we don't necessarily watch that often, right? I'm talking not even Fox News, but I'm talking the far right, OAN and those types of networks. Issues that are major there that the mainstream audience might not see. You'll see Governor Kemp play into. Already, he's taken 3 trips to the U.S. border with Mexico and Texas in the past year. He has railed against critical race theory, even though there's no evidence that graduate level course is even being taught in K through 12 systems around the state. And there'll be others. I mean, there's more that the litigation against vaccine mandates. All this is meant to send a message to conservative voters. And I think with the legislative session about to begin, the regular legislative session about to begin in January, you're going to see more conservative attempts from Kemp. He doesn't have to, I think to his camp, he doesn't have to prove his conservative bona fide, like his conservative credentials. But faced with a David Perdue perspective challenge, he might try to go into realms he wasn't necessarily going to go into. He might support a constitutional carry for guns, which,
So are you suggesting that while they're fighting over the far right, where's the middle going to go?
That's a great question, because you saw Stacey Abrams not even really, or Kemp, not really cater to the middle. I mean, I mentioned how she was embracing, broad-based themes like education and expanding Medicaid, which polls show us a numerical support for in Georgia. But she's also said over and over again she's authentic, and she doesn't want to abandon those authentic liberal principles. And this was a sea change in Georgia, because we've seen for decades Democrats run as kind of Republican lights, run as NRA Democrats, run with very moderate / even conservative principles underpinning their campaign, because they felt like they didn't want to lose a race because they came out in favor of gun control. And that started to change really in 2016, but in a major way in 2018 with Stacey Abrams. So I think the bet is that the middle will end up taking sides either way with the more partisan approaches. And so by energizing your base, you'll also win over the middle. And that was really what the fundamental battle between Stacey Abrams and Stacey Evans was in 2018. They actually had similar
Wait,
stances.
say that one more time, Greg. Repeat what you just said.
Yeah.
So I can make sure I got it.
No, I'm happy to. That was what one of the fundamental Democratic battles in 2018 was between Stacey Abrams and Stacey Evans. They both actually had similar stances on a lot of major policies. They had issues where they deviated, but for the most part, they believed in the same broader principles. But it was about their approach. And Stacey Evans was insistent that you have to appeal to Republican women in the suburbs in order to win, where Stacey Abrams said you have to be true to your party's ideology, to your core values. And if you do that, you might end up winning over those formerly Republican women in the suburbs anyway. And obviously, we saw in the primary whether or not it was a referendum on Stacey Abrams' approach or just her overall support for Stacey Abrams, her way won out. And frankly, it showed not just in 2018, but 2020, because Senators Warnock and Ossoff did not run as moderates by any means, right? They ran promising to vote on the very same packages that they're either already voted for or about to vote for, expanding the social safety net, funding infrastructure measures, and coronavirus relief package that included really major child tax credits that seek to end child poverty. So I think that's the tactic. I don't think you're going to see a real push for quote unquote undecided voters and a real insistent effort to win over moderates, I think that both candidates will go after their bases and hope that the moderates end up going for them as well.
Okay, I think you're telling me no cause for panic. Talking about the Georgia municipal elections, what does the turnout from this election offer in terms of thoughts for 2022?
Yeah, it's the same. A lot of the same as what I mentioned in Virginia. It's hard to translate what happens in a municipal election with very low turnout to what will happen next year when the entire nation will be focused on our races. It wasn't a great night for Democrats because a number of Republican incumbents either won or Republicans kept those seats. Of course, these are all nonpartisan seats I'm talking about, but there was candidates who identified as Republican and Democrats really wanted to flip Sandy Springs. They really wanted to flip Johns Creek. They really wanted to flip Tucker, Marietta. And in all four of those metropolitan suburban areas, Democrats lost. And in some cases, like in Sandy Springs and in Marietta, the Republicans incumbents won by wide margins. And I was on Bill Neiget's Political Rewind this morning with Rusty Paul, and he was saying even his internal numbers showed a much closer race against Dante Carter, the Democratic candidate who ran against them, and it ended up being a very easy victory for Rusty Paul. So I think there were some issues with polling, and that's also what we call a low information race in some cases, because voters tend to show up and vote for the incumbent if they don't really know much about either candidate. I can promise you that the 2022 election will not be a low information race because you won't be able to avoid advertisements, news coverage, flyers, mailers, all that. So people our poll showed 40% undecided in the Atlanta mayoral race, which was an astounding number even in October. By contrast, polls of the gubernatorial race in 2018 that soon showed like 2% undecided, 3% undecided. So there'll be few undecided voters. And there'll be high turnout. So it's hard to translate that. I will say that for all the successes Republican candidates had in those major mayoral races, Democrats noted that they flipped a few dozen council races and mayoral races, especially in smaller cities, in rural areas. I'm going down to Cuthbert, Georgia, in Randolph County, where a Democratic candidate beat a Republican incumbent in this town of just a few hundred people, as an example. So there were some things to crow about down the ticket, but where the Metro Atlanta suburbanites live, it wasn't the best night for Democrats, but also not something to go tear your hair out about. It's just impossible to use that as a proving ground for next year. I will say one more thing to add about that: the Republicans will take some of the lessons from Virginia, and they're already applying them in Georgia. I mean, for instance, Brian Kemp would love to run the Glenn Youngkin path, right? The candidacy, keeping Trump at arm's length, talking about issues that energize culture war issues, about race and education that really energize his base. But I think Kemp, in his heart of hearts, and his campaign team really knows this too, he won't be able to do that. He can't keep Trump at arm's length because Trump won't let him. Trump will continue his war against Brian Kemp, I think, no matter what he does.
Yeah, I think just the last thing to comment about these municipal elections is it did feel like the Republican Party was the state Republican Party was behind their candidates, and that, I mean, there were all, ads running for Rusty Paul on MSNBC that felt nonstop. And we didn't see that from the Democratic side. So there was an investment in those victories. Does feel like it kind of paid off.
Yeah, I mean, both parties kind of use this as an opportunity to kind of remobilize their ground game. So you had volunteers knocking on doors across Metro Atlanta suburbs and in certain other parts of the state. But Republicans had more big money efforts behind them. And there was flyers out there that used dire language saying, don't let Sandy Springs become Atlanta. Don't let Johns Creek become Atlanta. That meant
using pictures of other states.
Yeah, using pictures of Maryland, if I remember correctly. We reported it. I think it was the city of Maryland. So yeah, using this dire imaging that some saw as racist and, but just didn't fit with, Johns Creek at all. And really didn't fit with the city of Atlanta because, as you mentioned, they were using images from other states. But that has been proven to energize voters in the past. And the candidates we talked about it with for a story a week or so before the election made no apologies. They said, yeah, we don't want Johns Creek to become part of Atlanta, to become more like Atlanta. And I will extend that to say that like Atlanta has become, and I wrote a story about this today, in connection with a big economic development deal that was just sealed today with the new Norfolk Southern headquarters in Midtown. That was a city-state partnership that happened in the last days of Nathan Deal's term, back when city-state relations were pretty strong. You could never see that deal happen now because Republicans are openly warring with Atlanta, and Atlanta is fighting back. And I think this next session, you're going to see all sorts of infighting over Atlanta. You see Republican candidates who have nothing to do with, who barely stepped foot in the city of Atlanta, embrace the idea of Buckhead City and embrace the idea of new state oversight over the Atlanta airport. And they're playing, into all these local issues in a way that you wouldn't have expected Republicans who often talk about the primacy of local control to talk about.
So we could probably do a whole conversation on Buckhead, but let's talk about the mayoral election.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? And it seems like Atlanta voters made some kind of a statement about it's not same old anymore.
You're exactly right. And it shocked a lot of people, including me. I was going by our polls, which showed a 40% undecided. It showed Felicia Moore in the poll position with about 40% of the vote. And it showed Kasim Reed with a pretty big advantage a major advantage over Andre Dickens, who was in the single digits in both of our polls, which were conducted by UGA. The poll had Felicia Moore right and had Kasim Reed about right. But what it didn't have right was where all those undecided voters were going to break, which was to Andre Dickens. And we were gearing up for a race between Felicia Moore and the Anyone But Kasim coalition versus Kasim. And instead, voters gave a pretty resounding verdict saying they don't want any more of Kasim Reed. And this was a candidate who had 90% name recognition. All but the newest residents of Atlanta were the most, inattentive, I guess is the word, residents of Atlanta knew who he was. And he only got about a fifth of the vote. So that speaks volumes. And it really makes for a completely unpredictable race. That could be even lower, could be far lower turnout because you don't have a galvanizing presence like Kasim Reed on the ballot. You're seeing Democratic officials split, between Andre Dickens and Felicia Moore. So far, the two have been pretty cordial with each other. But whoever wins faces huge challenges, starting with curbing the crime rate in Atlanta and convincing lawmakers they don't need to go down this path of allowing a referendum to divorce the city of Atlanta, split it between Buckhead and the city, because this would set a dangerous precedent, they say. And corporate leaders are coming out against it. Every single Democrat who represents the city is, of course, against it. And agencies like the Georgia Municipal Authority, Georgia Municipal Association, are against it as well, because they worry that if Atlanta is able to split up, then other cities could take the same path. And that could wreak havoc on just the finances and the local government operations of all these municipalities.
I think in this election, we saw these nonpartisan elections become very, very partisan. And it's hard to imagine that what's going on with Buckhead doesn't also have a heavy partisan influence. But I'm going to leave it at that so we can move on, because I want us to have time to look backward to 2020. But before we do that, we need a huge thank you to you, because we're so grateful to you for the vital role you played in truth-telling. As a journalist, what are your thoughts on the role played by fake news in 2020, both in Georgia and beyond?
It's pervasive, and we don't know how to combat it. I mean, I'll just be honest, right? I mean, it got to a point where even feeling like, tweeting or correcting the record in stories or in social media was counterproductive, because it just reemphasized, in a way, even though we were correcting the lies, it just felt like to some people it was reemphasizing those lies. And we became a lot more robust about calling them lies, even if we didn't want to repeat them. And I was proud of the way that our organization and other media outlets did that, said Trump was lying, said he was trying to undermine the election results outright. He said he was trying to overturn Georgia's election. And that took guts from our leadership to be able to say that we could report that, because there's, every single day, including today, my inbox is full and my emails and my social media messages are full of people saying that Trump won and that we were part of the lying corporate media, or whatever you want to call it. And I saw firsthand the frustration of some of these believers of these lies, who won't believe the AJC or any other outlet, even the Wall Street Journal or Fox News in some cases, but who are completely absorbing these far right outlets that really, became a force into themselves. I remember my wake up call was at a rally in Johns Creek, I think it was. It was like Wills Park, where I used to run cross country. I went to North Springs High School and ran cross country. And I remember the last time I had been to this park was a race where I actually broke my arm when I was a junior, getting trampled by my own team. So it was a kind of a return to that park. And it was a Stop the Steal rally organized by Lynn Wood. And I thought there'd be, a couple dozen people there and some curious onlookers. And instead, I couldn't find parking. I was almost late. I had to park like a mile down the road because there were so many people at this event. And, I dare say, like, not just fringe people you might see in the grocery store, people you might see at, serving in elected bodies in your communities. And again, this was Alpharetta, Johns Creek area. This wasn't, in the rural heartland by any means, and a huge turnout. And I was interviewing people as they left, and I would, time and time again, I'd interview voters who felt like they couldn't even vote in the runoff because they said, "Oh, Trump is saying the absentee ballot system is flawed, but Trump is also saying the Dominion voting machines are flawed. Where do I vote?" And they were genuinely asking me, and I wanted to just tell them, you can, don't believe these lies, but they weren't listening to me anyway. So this fake news, in this sense, probably played into Democratic advantage. We saw tens of thousands of Republican voters who voted in the November election and didn't vote in the runoff election, and they were seen as like hard Republican voters internally by the Republican campaigns. So that totally backfired. And if you ask David Perdue or Kelly Loeffler right now what cost them the race, they'd say that. But also, I always want to point out, Democrats did their job too. It wasn't just because of Republican apathy or believing in the lies. It was because Democrats kept that coalition together, and in some cases even expanded on it. John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, outdid their poll totals even in one rural county in Georgia. So they did tremendous work staying on message and keeping that coalition energized while Republicans didn't. And that's really what it came down to. But the big lie and all those other lies played into it. And we're still seeing those reverberate. We're still seeing state elected officials who a few years ago weren't seen as fringe. We're seen as pretty moderate. Brandon Beach is one of them. He's a state senator who represents the Alpharetta area. And, he voted for, he's voted for casino gambling and gambling initiatives in the past. He's voted against gun expansions in the past, right? I mean, he's a Chamber of Commerce guy who is completely transformed into this sort of far right pro-Trump lawmaker who has been repeating these lies time and time again, and has found a home in conservative media for this. So it's been really hard for us to try to, in the traditional media, to try to overcome those lies. And frankly, it is not necessarily our job either to try to combat every single lie that comes up. It's more of just tell the truth, and hope that message gets through.
Well, I think you're sort of getting at the answer to this question, but from now on, you're going to be the person who literally wrote the book on Georgia's 2020 election. So my question is, and maybe you've answered it, was 2020 a one-off? Was it a reaction against Trump and Trumpism? Or is there something more lasting happening here in Georgia?
It's a great question. And it's obviously too soon to say it's a one-off. Republicans certainly are seeing the Virginia results and others as like evidence that it's a one-off. But we won't know until next November. But I can say that I've seen the energy in Democratic circles continue. And it's hard to get people, to have people stay as mobilized as they were in January, especially after all that we've been through. And not just the election, but the pandemic and the protests for the movement for social justice and racial equality, and all the other things that went into to last year. I mean, I was with Senator Warnock earlier today, and he said, and I've heard it said before, but we're all still going through this PTSD of the last year, Republicans, Democrats, everyone, from what we went through. And it will take time for us all to process that. And I think people are still processing that, of course. The lives lost, the toll it's taken on families and on traditional works. I mean, we still don't have our office really back at the AJC, so I still don't really have a place to go on most days, which is just a very minor part of it. But it's a reminder every single day that the pandemic is still, still the effect is still gripping our lives. So I'd say that it's going to be. The story of 2020 is going to continue in 2022. The Republican rifts that were sparked by Trump will still continue in 2022. Trump will still be a dominant storyline, whether we like it or not. And there's a lot of Democrats who hate it when I write about Trump. But he's endorsed 4 candidates in Georgia, has pledged to defeat Brian Kemp, and has disavowed 3 other candidates who are running for election. So he'll continue to be that storyline. And Democrats, as I mentioned earlier, are pretty united, and they're certainly coalescing behind Raphael Warnock, and they would behind Stacey Abrams. But there could be this whole moderate versus liberal rift in Georgia involving Carolyn Bordeaux, and however her district gets remade. So Republicans will be very eager to like kind of point across the aisle and say, hey, they're fighting too. Why aren't you covering that? And we will be covering that as well. So whether this is an anomaly, my gut says it's not. And I'll be honest, it's despite the fact that odds or history is kind of stacks against the party in power during midterms. History doesn't account for all the wildness going on in Georgia elections right now, with the former president openly warring with members of his own party in Georgia and really trying to shape the Georgia elections. So how that plays out will be really fascinating, especially if Herschel Walker is the Senate nominee, like is expected at this point. He's by far and away the front runner. And Trump has endorsed him, but is not backing other candidates who could be on that ballot.
So I can see all these questions popping up. I want to make sure we have time to get to them. But and I know you want us to buy the book, but can you give us a pre-press sneak preview? So I get that Trump played a huge role and will continue to play a huge role in Georgia. And I'm hearing what you're saying about energy, and I'm attributing, just because of where I sit, I know what you mean is the role that grassroots played, right?
Yes.
A shout out to us, right? But what else do you want to tell us about how Georgia flipped?
Yeah, I mean, that of course the grassroots energy on the party level was a huge part of it, and it's groups like yours. It's groups like the groups that sprung up around John Ossoff's 2017 run in Congress. It's groups that have been out there for a long time, like Red Clay Democrats, that played this instrumental role. And it was really fascinating to write this book and really find all these dominant trend lines. Like I could begin the book really, or at least the second chapter, with John Ossoff's run, and end it with him, because I was there for so much of it, right? I didn't have to recreate these scenes. Pretty much every scene in the book, I was either there or in the periphery. And so I could write about, I could write about John Ossoff after Lucy McBath wins the race, kind of, questioning whether or not he should have actually run, because it was so close. Remember, he had gone through this really rough and tumble, brutal 2017 race as a 29-year-old, as a 30-year-old, who is being pilloried as this nobody who should never have run. Comes within a whisker of actually flipping the district, loses to Karen Handel, sits out the next race, watches Lucy McBath win, and then wonders to himself, did I screw up? Was that my last chance? Goes to a Republican dominated county up in Northeast Georgia, invites me to go along with him. So I drive up to the middle of nowhere in Stevens County, I think it was, in a cold, dreary December night, and listen to him completely energize this crowd of like 50 hardcore Democrats in this very red area with much more liberal policies than he embraced during his 2017 run. And I think he realized then that's the ticket, be authentic. He was trying to toe this middle line in 2017, and no one could blame him for it. I'm not disparaging him for it, because that was the way to win in the suburbs, right? You had to kind of be moderate. You had to keep Nancy Pelosi at arm's length. You couldn't talk about Bernie Sanders and all this. 2020, he embraced that core liberal ideology. I think he embraced who he is, which is a liberal, right? As a progressive. There was this one moment that I'll never forget, where he was asked about, Bernie Sanders had endorsed him. He was asked if he accepted Bernie Sanders' endorsement. And in 2017, he would have said, no way. I'm focused on Georgia and Georgians and who Georgians are. And in this race, he said, of course I do, because I want to galvanize and energize that liberal wing of the party. And I think that's if there's one thing that I really learned writing this book, was that being authentic goes such a long way. And you can say the same thing on the Republican side too, because Casey Cagle, that secretly recorded tape was really his doom, even before Trump endorsed Brian Kemp.
Speaking of authentic, let's talk about Lucy McBath, because you mentioned her just a second ago. It looks pretty rough the way her district's been cut, and that it's going up into Forsyth County. She's going to have the entirety of Forsyth County. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, and by the way, I just plugged my book in the chat.
Thank you.
Because my wife and my editor would be mad if I didn't. That's a great question about Lucy McBath. We've always expected Republicans to go either two routes. They could go super aggressive and try to draw both the 6th and 7th as friendly to conservatives, but then risk losing both later in the decade. They could probably draw it so that Republican candidates win next year, but both might lose in 2024 or 2026. So I expect them to take the sort of safer path, which is drawing Lucy McBath out of that district, making it very difficult for her to win, and making the 7th district for Carolyn Bordeaux much more easier for a Democrat to win. And that achieves a few things for Republicans. They see Lucy as a star, much more than they see Carolyn Bordeaux as a star, frankly, right? And so they want to knock her out. They would love nothing more than a intra-party duel, like I was saying earlier, between the moderate and the liberal. If nothing but to distract some of the attention away from the Trump versus not so Trump factions of the Republican Party, and so it would kind of help drive that media narrative. So I expect there to be really tough decisions for Lucy McBath, depending on how this district is drawn. And we've seen the Senate map; we haven't seen the House map. We don't think the House will take up exactly what the Senate map did, but I do expect, when it's all said and done, for Lucy for Congresswoman McBath to be in a much harder district. And she'll have to face the decision. Does she try to flip a district like that? And that depends on the numbers. Will it be a plus, 10 for Republicans, or will it be a plus 6? So I expect it to be higher. I expect it to be, something safely conservative. And then she'll have to make the decision. Do I run for that district? Do I try to run for statewide office, like lieutenant governor, or if Stacey Abrams doesn't run for governor? Or does she primary Carolyn Bordeaux, or run for or primary another Democrat? I don't expect that, but I would think that there's a distinct possibility that she primaries Carolyn Bordeaux, because in Congress you don't have to live, as you all know, in your district to run.
That would leave her district with no one to fight for it. And I think the story that you just told about those hidden Democrats, when John went, to this, what we would have, to this exurb, that maybe there are folks out there that, just need a candidate to rally around.
Yeah. And it gives an opportunity, if she does do that, it gives an opportunity for a Democrat to step up and raise that banner. And look, the party, the establishment figures would almost certainly back Lucy McBath because of her stances on issues like the infrastructure bill, like on liberal issues. That Carolyn Bordeaux always ran as a centrist, which helped her in the general, but could definitely hurt her in a contested primary. But look, the party also wants someone strong to run, and even if it's a losing bid, to help energize.
We've learned is we need a candidate in every race.
Yeah.
because we need to get counted and we need our voters to know that their votes get counted.
My best example of that, and Mike Walensky went to high school with me. He used to live down the street from me. We've known each other for years. And so he obviously flipped that 2018 district against all odds, right? He was running against a former mayor of Dunwoody who everyone seemed to at least know his name. But it was actually the election cycle before that when Tom Taylor was representing the district as a sort of moderate Republican who had a DUI. And I mean, it was well known. He had this. He was charged with driving under influence with teenagers in his backseat and with weapons in his car. And he was seen as, that moment, he was the most vulnerable Republican in the entire legislature. And yet the rest happened after qualifying and no Democrat had raised their hands to run. So he would have been a sitting duck. I mean, he would have lost by 10 points if any Democrat had raised their hand to run, but no one was in that race. And this was Dunwoody. It's amazing to think about that now because Dunwoody is so solidly blue, but just a few years ago, it was seen as such safely conservative that no one even bothered to run against Tom Taylor that year.
All right. So talking about counting votes, let's talk about Georgia's voter suppression laws. Can voter registration and voter turnout overcome the obstacles that have been put in our path? I mean, it feels a lot like these laws are a deliberate effort to cause Democrats to stumble. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, and let's be clear too. A lot of Republicans, when we asked why are you embracing these issues, and some of them said there's no reason. I mean, there was no tangible evidence of voter fraud, as we've all documented so thoroughly, of widespread voter fraud. There was, very, very minor issues here and there about absentee ballots that were uncovered during the Cobb audit, but nothing to indicate any sort of widespread irregularities. But Republicans felt like they had to placate their base that was so upset by these lies about election fraud. You used to not hear Democrats really talk about restrictive voting measures because they worried that it would send a signal to their voters not to even bother because your vote won't be counted. And that certainly was an issue during the Jim Crow era and in past decades. But you really saw that starting to change in the last decade, especially with Stacey Abrams, who made the calculated risk, I guess it is, that talking more about it would only energize voters to try to make sure that their ballot counted. And in 2020, we saw that rhetoric kind of crystallize with the make a plan to vote. And I think look, when people ask me from either party what to do, if they're worried about their vote counting, I tell them that. There's multiple ways to cast ballots now. And so don't just rely on hoping that there's not a long line on election day. And you all know this, but it's about telling others or in your circles and your friends and your relatives that absentee ballots, there's still use of ballot drop boxes. They're just going to be diminished. There's still going to be early in-person voting. And in some cases in rural parts of rural Georgia, it's actually expanded. So there's still multiple options to vote. And there's multiple options to track your absentee ballots in particular. And so the onus is on voters to make sure that they fulfill that duty and to get educated. And we thankfully only saw minor issues in these past municipal elections when it came to the new voting law. But it really wasn't a true test because there were such low turnout elections that we won't really see the true test until next year's primary. And then of course, next year's general. So it's hard to say like Republicans are saying that, the laws really had no impact. We just don't know that yet. But we do know that there are very vigorous education efforts going out there because there's nothing really to do to change. You can't change that law right now. There's just not the votes, but that you can educate voters about, hey, if you show up at the wrong precinct, your vote won't get counted. You've got to do this or that. All the new rules, all the new deadlines, all the new absentee ballot ID requirements, all those will take a lot of education because there's a lot of people who aren't tuned in right now.
Well, I know we live in the South, but it seems like voter suppression and gerrymandering, they strike me as kissing cousins. They do seem to come from the same family stock, don't you think? That so tell us about the stumbling block that we should expect from the latest district maps.
Yeah, and the district maps are I'll be honest, they're not as tough on Democrats as I thought. And of course, every discussion with this has to begin with the fact that Democrats did the same thing. And in many cases, in the 90s, went even further. I mean, there were some weird districts that went from Atlanta to Savannah to try to preserve Democratic majorities. in Congress. That all being said, I think a lot of people in the State House thought Republicans would go more aggressive. And certainly, this is not to whitewash what the Republican majority is doing, because they're drawing maps to preserve their majority into the next decade. But in some cases, in many cases, they're drawing maps less aggressive than even some hardcore Republicans wanted it to be. In the House, for instance, where Republicans have about 105 seat advantage, 103, 105, they're drawing the districts to lose about 6 or 7 seats. And in the Senate, they're basically drawing the districts to preserve their majority, maybe pick up a seat. But actually, I think they'll end up losing. They'll probably net loss of 1 or 2 seats. But they're not trying to expand their majorities by a wide margin. And that's not because they're being kind-hearted or they're realizing that they need to, there's a new ascendant coalition in Georgia and they need to reflect the state's diversity. That's because of legal challenges. That's all because they know that there's litigation is right around the corner, and that frankly, they'd lose some of these legal battles when it comes to applying the racial aspects of federal voting rights laws. And so that's come up in all the sort of private conversations I've had with the people who are drawing the maps, is that, they know they can only do so much. And there's also the concern that, hey, they can't retinker these maps later on. They're not going to be redrawing the maps in 2026. This is their shot. And just as I said with the congressional districts, they could try to they could try to go for both seats and maybe win them next year, but risk losing both down the line. Or they can try, in their view, to keep at least one in Republican hands well into the next decade and kind of write off the other one.
So I think the message is it's bad, but it's not as bad as it could be.
Yeah, and I know that's not a comforting message for Democrats.
There's a little comfort in it.
But it really, not that it really could have been, and many expected it to be much worse. And look, that's also a testament to Speaker David Ralston, who's very conservative, but is not in that sort of foam at the. He's not a far right Republican by any means. He gets it.
Well, I think our task tonight was more than a little ambitious, and of course, time is a cruel arbiter. But I want to leave time for a few questions. But before we go to questions, I just kind of want to open it up. What message do you want to leave us with?
It's almost the message you gave at the beginning. And I as a reporter, I'm not encouraging anyone to run for office or anything like that, but I am encouraging people to stay involved and to stay active and to stay informed. And if that what makes you want to get more involved with the political process down at the Capitol, there's room for you. And I always use this. I want to use this story here because everyone knows him. But Mike Walensky, who I mentioned earlier, I don't think I went to high school with him. He was not a part of the SGA. I was, right. He was not very active at UGA and the Young Democrats or the Young Republicans or any political organization. I was the one covering all that stuff for the school newspaper. But I saw him sort of blossom as a candidate as he started getting more energized. And frankly, I had that sort of outdated view of Dunwoody as a Republican bastion. So I didn't give him much of a chance to flip the district against the former mayor. And Ken Wright, and he did, right? And he got involved in the local level. And it goes to show, and certainly he had supporters helping him raise money and get his message out, and he had a lot of help. But he got involved and flipped the district, coming from no political background. So it just goes to show you what you can do with that energy and with that vigor. And he's in a good stance going into 2022 because the Republicans did not mess with him, and I thought they might. I thought there was a chance that they could go after his district or draw him in with Josh McLaurin next door in Sandy Springs or with Beth Moore in Gwinnett, but they didn't. And that sort of energy and activism, you guys have already made a mark, right? And you have a chance to make a bigger mark in 2022. And I know sometimes it's hard to stay motivated. It's hard for grassroots Republicans to do the same thing, but there's a lot of reason to stay involved, and you're about to hear a lot more of it in the next year.
Well, that message is music to our ears, music to my ears especially, and I hope to everybody. So I hope everyone is listening to it. Let's take a look at some of these questions and see where we're going to start. I know I saw somebody, Elaine said, make sure that you do an audiobook.
Yes, they are. Penguin Random House is in charge of that one, but it won't be my raspy voice, thankfully.
No, I think it should be your voice. We love your voice.
It sounds like I'm a smoker, even though I've never smoked. My dad was a lung doctor and used to tell me whenever he saw someone smoking, that guy is paying for your bar mitzvah.
So Beryl Ann asked about you, and you talked about the polls. Are the polls losing their credibility?
Yeah, they are. It's getting, especially when it comes to like to more localized races, like a race for mayor or a race for Congress. It's really hard, and it's not just the public polls like we do. It is the internal polls that candidates do. Just like I mentioned, Mayor Paul was saying his polls were not reliable, and of course, in his case, it worked out. But I don't think Kasim Reed's poll showed him in third place by that margin. I think they showed him in very strong position going into it. So it's really hard. Fewer people are using landlines, but pollsters still predominantly rely on landlines. I don't have a landline at my house. People like me don't pick up the phone if they see a number they don't recognize. I'd rather go to voicemail and take the risk that I missed an important call than pick up and get stuck on a call with a.
Well, that's hard for us because that means they don't answer our calls when we call to get out the vote. So
yeah, it is, right. I mean, there's a backlash there too. But I think in general, it was a red flag in our poll that 40% of the electorate was still undecided, and that might have been spot on. But it's getting harder. And look, we saw that in 2017. We had a poll that showed Ossoff up, I think, 7 points against Karen Handel a week before the election. And it just wasn't reflecting what I saw on the ground, which was a much closer race. I didn't know who was going to win, but I knew it wasn't a 7-point, that would have been a blowout victory for John.
Okay. So Stacy Epstein asked a question you're going to know. I don't know what she's talking about. She said, speaking of media and dire need for factual coverage, do you anticipate any pulling back on political coverage, given the significant changes being rolled out by the AJC? So tell us about
that. And what she's referring to is our print product is significantly changing. And it's we've sold our printing press in Gwinnett County, and we're now being printed out of Gainesville, a production facility out of Gainesville. And it's a major change for us. I won't sugarcoat it, right? I mean, it means smaller printed newspapers. It means there's no standalone Metro section, for instance. It means for us reporters, a much earlier deadline, which we're still working out. Events that happen, like let's say right now, if there's breaking news. When Keisha Lance Bottoms announced she wasn't running, that was one of the crazier deadline nights of my life, because I was tasked with confirming that the Mayor Bottoms wasn't going to run for a second term. And I was at the Fogo de Chao down the street doing like a benefit for Dunwoody police officers. And I happened to step out and try to confirm it. And it happened around 7:55. And we were able to get it in the front page of the next day's paper. We won't be able to do that anymore with these new earlier deadlines. All that said, though, that's a change for the print product that you hold in your hands. The e-paper, the AJC online editions, all that will be, the plan is even more robust. I don't read the print paper myself. I read it, I'm a subscriber, but I get it, the e-paper every morning, and I read it the first thing when I wake up. So I don't even know what's in the print paper is different than the e-paper. And I think that's the future. You've seen other markets, newspapers.
What percentage of the readership is print?
Our circulation is down. I'm not sure exactly what the number is, but it's not where it was. It used to be 200,000 on Sundays, 250 on Sundays, not that long ago, and 150 on weekdays, and it's not near there anymore because frankly, I think we're steering people towards digital, and they're still paying for subscriptions, but it's much cheaper for them and for us. For digital subscriptions, because it costs a lot of money to deliver the papers and get the gas and hire the carriers and pay for the fuel and all the other stuff that goes along with delivering a newspaper, when it can just go into your phone for millions.
Philip was asking about Marjorie Taylor Greene, and what do you know about the Democratic candidates, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and real quick, just to finish that thought about. But our political coverage isn't going anywhere. I mean, even if we're down to 20 reporters, I'd expect half of them to be on politics, because the paper's leadership recognizes that this is going to be a major issue. And it used to be such a sleepy beat when I started it at the beat. I'd be the only reporter at many, many events. And now now you're seeing New York Times reporters everywhere trying to come into our turf. But we love them. Marjorie Taylor Greene and the Democrats. It's a great question, because I know that especially she's so polarizing, and people love to, to be shocked at her latest affront. And of course, part of it, she's doing it purpose to go get that shock outrage. And part of it is just who she is. And I go back with her to Alon's over in Dunwoody when we had coffee together before I even knew who she was. And she was announcing a run against Karen Handel and wanted to meet me. And she was just going to be a slightly more conservative version of Karen Handel. And little did I know who would she end up being. But look, I mean, the district's going to be so heavily Republican. And the Democrat who was supposed to run against her last year was a man named Kevin Von Osdale, an IT specialist who ended up being so bullied and so harassed that he abandoned his campaign. He split up with his wife and he moved to the Midwest in the middle of the race. And I'm not saying that's going to happen to any of the Democrats running now. I'm just saying that's the tactics that she's unafraid to sort of leverage. And I'm not saying she wasn't the one necessarily leading the charge bullying him, but it was her supporters that really got into his head. And it's going to be really tough for any Democrat to win that district, no matter how capable or confident that candidate is, because you're not seeing Republicans turn against her. John Cowan is the Republican runoff opponent against Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a 7th generation resident of that part of town, a neurosurgeon. He's not an idiot, right? He's a brilliant doctor, very conservative, who basically branded himself as conservative without the crazy. He was going to be a reliable conservative vote, but just not Marjorie Taylor Greene, and he got trounced. So that politics works in a district that polarized, and even though that some establishment Republican leaders probably cringe at what she says, they know too they can't redraw those districts to make life harder for her because she'll just move. She didn't live in Rome. She lived in Milton. She lived up in North Fulton County, and she moved to Rome to run. So if they draw her out of the district, she'll just move to another district and run and probably win a Republican primary.
Yeah. All right. One last question from Susan, and then we'll try to finish up. What types of constitutional amendments should we expect for the that are coming up?
Yeah, it's a great question because it depends on what how far to the right Kemp wants to move, what efforts he'll embrace, right? I mean, because if he didn't have to worry about a primary challenge, we'd expect teacher pay raises and, just, minor base pleasing things, but really focus on broader base stuff that would help him in a general election. Like, hey, I promised teachers $5,000 pay raise. I fulfilled that promise. I still think he'll do that because there's lots of money in the budget now. But if he really thinks David Perdue is a threat, you could see him embrace a constitutional carry amendment. You could see him embrace the referendum to split Atlanta into two parts. You could see him embrace some other conservative leaning efforts like new crackdowns on illegal immigration. Things like that I don't think going into this he thought he'd have to tackle. But if David Perdue is looming, like he is, it is a very real possibility that David Perdue, I don't think David Perdue will run that's just my gut, but there's a very real possibility that I'm wrong. And if you're Governor Kemp, you've got to plan for that. And by planning for that, that means you've got to be able to show that, hey, I signed this anti-abortion measure into law 2 years ago, but now I'm taking even this step to fight illegal immigration or expand gun rights or any number of his other promises that he has yet to fulfill.
So you took us up, you made us feel really good, and now you're just slamming us back down again.
I should have reversed that order.
Yeah, we want to sleep tonight. Thank you, Greg. When you decided to become a journalist, you could not possibly have foreseen the critical role that you would play in our American democracy. We rely on our local paper, the AJC, to keep us informed and updated about what's happening in our state. It's true that information is power, and it's equally true that we could not do what we do without you and your colleagues at the AJC. So we are so grateful. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for what you do every day in protecting the sacred role of journalism to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. And we mean that truly from the bottom of our hearts.
Well, it was such a pleasure talking to you guys. And I'll put my email on here too. So if there's ever anything I was about to put my old email on there. If there's ever anything you think we should be covering or just something you want to vent about, or if there's something you see that we're not covering adeptly enough, bring it on. We are here for you. And that's the beauty of working for a local newspaper and not a national,
Well, that's very gracious of you, because our members are going to take you up on that. They're going to write every edition. I keep telling them that we need to write letters to the editors and op-eds. So instead they'll just write you, but I hope they'll do that.
Do both.
I also want to thank our JDWS members for joining us tonight. Our work is driven by our collective passion, and I have no doubt, despite those last comments of Greg's, that we're going to flip our state and we're going to do it together. So that's a positive note to end on. Thank you everyone for coming. This was incredibly informative. I'll say not quite uplifting, but informative.
Part of it was.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys. Thank you again.
Okay, bye-bye.